Back in the final days of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union negotiated an agreement that the Soviets would withdraw from Eastern Europe and dismantle the Warsaw Pact, and in return the Americans would stop the NATO expansion and stop the encirclement of the Soviet Union. Basically, both sides were to ease the tensions and build up relations. But what happened next was that the Soviet withdrawal from Eastern Europe triggered a series of nationalist revolts throughout the USSR, and the unintended consequence here was the breakup of the Soviet Union. In the aftermath of this collapse, NATO quickly moved into the former Warsaw Pact members and even expanded into the former Soviet states in the Baltics. Now, from the perspective of the new NATO members, joining the alliance made sense given their past experiences with the Soviet Union. But from a Russian perspective, this was an utter betrayal. Fast forward to 2005, the Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a major geopolitical disaster. But Putin wasn't referring to the collapse of communism. No, he was referring to the fact that almost 3 centuries of Russian expansionist policy was reversed in a matter of days. Russia was basically retracted to its 17th century borders. Now, the Russians could have accepted the situation as it was, but then in 2003, the Rose Revolution unfolded in Georgia. A year later, the Orange Revolution hit Ukraine, and the Baltic countries joined NATO. Imagine what the Russian leadership was thinking. About 2 decades ago, they were betrayed and lost their global empire, and now NATO was moving into the remaining former Soviet states. The only thing that the Baltics, Ukraine, and the Caucasus add to NATO is to increase a multi-vector offensive strategy on the Russian Federation. From Russian perspective, this was the old NATO strategy of encirclement. And if things kept going at this speed, the very existence of the Russian Federation would be in question in a matter of years. And this is what Putin was referring to. It was a wake-up call for the Kremlin to reassert itself or perish in history. Welcome to Caspian Report by me, Shirvan. Now, what you have to understand here is that the Russian withdrawal from the geographic borders of the Soviet Union and the NATO expansion into those former Soviet states have left Russia feeling insecure. So that is the priority for Russia's foreign affairs, to reassert its influence in the former Soviet countries. Now, this doesn't mean direct annexation, because that would be a repeat of history, and history shows that directly controlling everything was too much of a burden for Russia. So instead, we're talking about a sphere of influence manifested in the form of the Eurasian Union. Now, the Russians say that this union is based on the structure of the European Union, but unlike the EU, the Eurasian Union is economically and politically dominated by one faction, Russia. So the Eurasian Union is really the manifestation of Russia's sphere of influence. Now, the primary goal of Russia is to protect its core and industrial heartland, which stretches from St. Petersburg to Moscow to Voronezh all the way to the Volgograd region. But this isn't just the financial and industrial core of Russia, it's also part of the European plain. This landform is composed of flat and open land. In military terms, this kind of terrain is indefensible. The European plain expands like a triangle to the east, and as the triangle widens, Russia's forces get stretched thinner and thinner. This means that the further NATO pushes east into the European plain, the more maneuverability and options the alliance has. And the more Russia pushes west, the less options NATO has and the more secure Russia gets. Think of this as a grand chessboard where you have to maximize the influence of your pawns by strategically positioning them. Now, thinking in military terms may seem paranoid for 2014, but remember, from the Russian perspective, there is no evidence to suggest that the West is trustable. Also, many of Russia's political advisors are Cold War veterans. These are men who calculate on capabilities and not on the promises of others. So this explains why the Russians see things through the military perspective. And even though it's true that as technology progresses, the role of geography and climate is diminishing, but the reality is that technology hasn't reached that threshold yet. History shows over and over again that geography matters. The German invasion of Russia, the Vietnam War, the Soviet-Afghan War, the American-Afghan War. In all these wars, the offensive side had full confidence in its technological superiority and yet failed to win against the geographic conditions. So geography matters. Based on this, the geopolitical objectives for Russia in the European plain is to push as far west as possible. That means 1. Russia cannot accept the NATO membership of the Baltic countries. US bombers and fighter jets are stationed on a 3-minute flight distance from St. Petersburg. The Russians are fully aware of this threat and know they have to be in control of the Baltic countries and anchor themselves against the sea. But aside energy politics and the ethnic Russian population in these countries, the Kremlin's options in this region are limited. Next, Russia needs Belarus as a buffer for its industrial heartland. In the last decade, Russia has managed to acquire almost every major industry in Belarus, and this has practically turned Belarus into a Russian colony. In correlation with this, Ukraine also serves as a buffer. Here, in eastern Ukraine, it's only about 700 kilometers of flat terrain to western Kazakhstan. If Kiev ever fell under the influence of a third country and that country managed to militarily block the Ukrainian-Kazakh gap, then Russia would lose control over the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea and from there lose the entire southern portion of Russia. Furthermore, in western Ukraine lies the center of the Carpathian Mountains. Russia needs to anchor itself in this geographic position as the Carpathians will slow down any land invasion. So Russia needs Ukraine as a buffer, and the Russians have a list of leverages they can implement to change Kiev's pro-Western orientation. These leverages range from politics to energy to finances all the way to the military presence in Crimea. Next is Moldova, which lies to the east of the Carpathians. This open terrain is historically known as Bessarabia, and it has always served as a buffer zone. If the Russians control Moldova, they can strengthen their Carpathian stronghold and use the country as a buffer against any invasion from the NATO-Romanian direction. So it's essential that Russia regains control over this country, and this can be done in a variety of ways. The most effective method is by using the separatist state of Transnistria as a leverage against Moldova. The second series of objectives is set in the South Caucasus. Russia needs to prevent from being flanked by NATO from the south. The truth is, Russia simply cannot handle a conflict from multiple directions, and anchoring itself in the South Caucasus gives Russia superb defensive positions. So here, Russia needs to control 3 independent countries: Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. That is easier said than done because unlike the rest of its neighbors, Russia is geographically separated from these countries. And to top it off, every one of these countries has a different foreign policy. The landlocked state of Armenia hosts the last Russian military base in the region. Over the past decade, the Russians have acquired every major industry in Armenia and thus have effectively turned the country into a Russian colony. Neighboring Georgia is also cash-strapped, but has access to the sea, and so the country functions like a gate to the region. This is the road in and out the Caucasus. And this also gives Tbilisi more flexibility, so the leadership decided to pursue a pro-NATO policy. And finally there is Azerbaijan, landlocked but energy and resource rich. Azerbaijan has a larger population than both of its neighbors combined, and the country accounts for about 80% of the total economy in the South Caucasus. Baku pursues a multi-vector policy, meaning it cooperates with the West and with Russia, and so depends on neither. Now, Russia's primary leverage in the region is to directly and indirectly support the separatist occupations. Basically, Abkhazia and South Ossetia are used as a balance of power against Georgia. However, this plan backfired when the Georgians grew tired of Russia's unconstructive position in the peace talks and looked to NATO for solutions. The final separatist occupied territory is Nagorno-Karabakh. Here, Russia militarily and financially enables Armenia to occupy a part of Azerbaijan known as Karabakh. And by locking these two countries in a conflict, Russia assures its own dominance in the region. Now, for the local people, all these conflicts are highly emotional subjects, but for Russia, it's part of the divide and rule strategy. This strategy is perhaps best exemplified in Central Asia, and this is Russia's third set of objectives, maintaining control over the former Soviet states in Central Asia. For centuries, Central Asia served as a Russian buffer against any Asian power. Here, the Tian Shan Mountains and the Altai Mountains provide Russia with superb defensive positions. But with the breakup of the USSR, China started to project soft power in the region through economic investments. Just recently, China's defense minister promised Tajikistan military aid in the amount of hundreds of millions of dollars. So in the case of Central Asia, not only the West, but the Chinese too present a threat to the Russians. The Western presence in this region mostly stems from the US military bases that were established to fight the Taliban in neighboring Afghanistan. But despite the American and Chinese presence, neither one has any real influence when compared to Russia. For example, Kazakhstan has an ethnic Russian population of 3.4 million. They hold some of the most influential governmental and financial positions in the country. Add to this the fact that Kazakhstan is landlocked and completely dependent on Russia for its importing and exporting routes, and you can see that Russia's position in Kazakhstan is secure. Next is Uzbekistan, the most populous country in Central Asia and historically the most assertive. About half of the total population in Central Asia resides in Uzbekistan. So to keep the country under control, the Soviet Union made strategic territorial changes in the Fergana Valley. Now, what you have to understand here is that this small valley is home to about 11 million people. Not only is this the most fertile place in the region, but it's home to about a fifth of the total population of entire Central Asia. That is how strategically important this place is. The Soviets simply divided the ethnically diverse valley in three subdivisions of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. The whole point of this was to strangle Uzbekistan in a balance of power with its neighbors, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. So none of these countries can really afford to step out of line. And finally, there is Turkmenistan, rich in oil and natural gas, but like all of Central Asia, landlocked and thus completely dependent on Russia for its trading routes. For the Russians, Turkmenistan serves as a buffer against Iran. But Turkmenistan, together with overseas Azerbaijan, has the potential to drag all of Central Asia out of the land block problem. That is, if the Caspian Railway is ever realized. This game-changing proposal would directly connect China with Europe, and thus would create a whole new trading route, and from there end the dependency of Central Asia on Russia. Financially and technically, this project is feasible, and it is supported by the Europeans, the Americans, and the Chinese. After all, it is the only gap left in the revival of the modern Silk Road. But for obvious geopolitical reasons, the Kremlin fiercely opposes this proposal, because ultimately Moscow needs to keep Central Asia divided from each other and dependent on Russia, and in the current situation, Russia's position is secure. Now, you may have noticed that all of these external objectives so far are related to the former Soviet states, and that is no coincidence. These countries are essential to Russia. Without them, Russia cannot guarantee its long-term security. This also explains why the Soviet Union incorporated these countries in the first place. The reality is that a retracted Russia has no good defensive options, and so it has to be offensive. Because the longer Russia remains passive, the more of its neighbors turn to the West. And so the Russians use a different strategy for every country. In some cases, natural gas price rates are used as a leverage. In other countries, it's the support for separatist regimes. And in other cases, it's a matter of divide and conquer. But this offensive attitude also backfires, and none of Russia's neighbors trust the Kremlin. So every nation will resist to their capabilities. In part 2 of Russia's geopolitics, we will explore the internal dynamics of Russia, from the modernization of the arms industry to the secessionist movements to the intelligence network. We will look at what keeps Russia together and what problems the country faces from within. For now, thanks for watching Caspian Report and see you in the second part. Sağ ol.